At 20 years old, I decided to combine my passion with my work. Since I was a child, paragliding was more than just a sport to me. It was a legacy, a connection with my father, who was a paragliding instructor. He taught me to love the wind, to feel the freedom of soaring through the air, and to understand that flying was not just about technique, but about trust and surrender. When he passed away a few years ago, I was devastated. It wasn't a paragliding accident. An illness took him far too quickly, but somehow the sky always made me feel close to him. Every flight was like a silent conversation, where I would whisper to him, "Look, Dad, I'm here. I'm flying just like you taught me." Paragliding became my refuge and my way of honoring his memory. When I turned 20, I decided it was time to turn this passion into something bigger. I became an instructor, just like he was. In the beginning, it was terrifying, not just because of the responsibility of guiding others in the air, but because every lesson I taught felt like reliving his words. I found myself repeating phrases he used to say, like, "The wind is your ally, not your enemy," or "Trust your wings, but trust yourself more." It was as if he was there, right beside me, guiding my every move. The first time I went up with a student, I felt a nervous excitement I hadn't experienced since my first flight with my father. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, and the wind was blowing gently, perfect for a smooth flight. As I adjusted the equipment and explained the basic commands, my voice trembled slightly, but I knew he would be proud. When we finally took off, the silence of the air and the breathtaking view reminded me why I loved this so much. It was as if time stood still, and I could feel his presence there in the wind carrying us. The view was breathtaking. As we gained altitude, the untouched forest stretched below us like an infinite green carpet, its hues shifting from emerald to moss, depending on how the sunlight hit the treetops. The gentle wind carried us with an almost intentional kindness, as if nature itself was guiding us. From above, we could see the rivers cutting through the jungle, glistening like silver threads under the blue sky. The air was fresh and pure, and the silence was broken only by the soft sound of the wind against the paraglider cords. As we glided toward the beach, the scenery began to change. The forest gave way to a golden stretch of sand, almost untouched, extending along the coast. The beach was quiet, the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time. The sea, in shades of turquoise blue, gently crashed against the shore, creating a calming rhythm. The sun, now lower on the horizon, cast golden reflections on the water, creating an almost magical effect, as if the sky itself was spilling into the ocean. The landing was smooth, almost as if the paraglider and the wind conspired to place us there with care. Our feet touched the soft sand, and for a moment we stood still, admiring that dreamlike place. The sea breeze carried a salty scent, mixed with the aroma of nearby vegetation. It was one of those places that made you believe in magic, where time seemed to slow down and the outside world simply disappeared. I looked at my student, whose eyes were still wide with awe, and smiled. "This is why I love flying," I said as we unstrapped the equipment. "Every flight is a new discovery, a new piece of beauty the world hides." At that moment, I felt a deep connection not only with nature, but also with my father's memory. It was as if he was there, sharing that view with me, reminding me that the sky and the earth would always be connected, just like us. One day, I received a message from a man saying he wanted to fly but was unsure and afraid. I explained that it was safe and arranged to meet him in person to go over everything and reassure him. We agreed to meet at a small beachfront bar, a relaxed and familiar place for me. On the scheduled day, I was already there waiting. That's when I saw a luxury car pull up. The man who stepped out was striking. Black hair with a few gray strands, a well-groomed beard, and an air of confidence that contrasted with the insecurity he had mentioned. He walked toward me with firm steps and introduced himself. "Alexander." I smiled and replied, "Nice to meet you, Alexander. You can call me Ben." That first meeting was brief, but I could already sense that something about it was different. He was more than just a client, and I had no idea how much that conversation would change things. We ended up talking for hours, and time seemed to fly by. I explained everything about paragliding, how it worked, the equipment, the safety procedures, and he listened attentively, asking questions here and there. The conversation flowed in a way that made it feel like we had known each other for years. At one point, he looked at me thoughtfully and said, "You know, Ben, don't I know you from somewhere? You seem so familiar." I shook my head, smiling. "I don't think so. I'm sure we've never met before." He chuckled softly, but his expression soon turned more serious. That was when he mentioned that he was going through a divorce and that things hadn't been easy. I tried to offer some words of encouragement, but the truth was, there wasn't much I could do other than listen. So I asked, "If you're so afraid, why do you want to do this flight now?" He was silent for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. "I've always been afraid to take risks, you know. I missed out on so many things I wanted to do because of fear or insecurity, always worrying about what others would think." That hit me. It seemed like he wasn't just talking about flying, but about something much bigger. Still, I stayed focused on the moment and replied, "I get it. Sometimes we have to face fear to discover what's on the other side." He looked at me, and for a moment, I felt that this conversation was about much more than paragliding. But I let it go, respecting his space. After all, everyone has their own timing. At one point in the conversation, he lightly placed his hand on my leg in a gesture that seemed casual but carried meaning. He looked at me with a smile, half shy, half teasing, and said, "Ben, I like meeting you. I hope we don't die on this flight so we can be friends." I laughed, feeling the atmosphere between us become lighter yet more intense at the same time. I responded with a smile. "Then we'll be friends because I'm good at what I do." He raised an eyebrow, as if testing my confidence, and asked in a playful tone, "Oh yeah, in everything you do?" I held his gaze for a moment, sensing the challenge in the air, and replied with a confident smile, "Absolutely." He laughed but didn't move his hand from my leg, and for a moment, the silence between us felt charged with something neither of us wanted to name yet. It was just a conversation, just a joke, but I could feel that this was the beginning of something bigger. Then he gave my leg a small tap, as if confirming something between us, and said, "All right then, when can we schedule the flight?" I thought quickly and replied, "I have a free slot on Saturday afternoon after lunch. Does that work for you?" He was silent for a moment, as if mentally reviewing his schedule, then nodded. "Sounds good to me." "It's a deal then," I said, smiling. He looked at me as if evaluating something, and then made an unexpected offer. "Do you live nearby? Want a ride?" For a moment, I thought about refusing. After all, I didn't live far and could walk, but something about that invitation made me accept. Maybe it was curiosity to know more about him, or just the way he seemed genuinely interested. "Actually, I don't live very far, but if it's not a bother, I'll take the ride." He smiled as if he had won a small victory and stood up from the table. "Not a bother at all. Shall we?" I got up as well, feeling that this ride could be the beginning of something, though I wasn't quite sure what. When we arrived in front of my building, I pointed at it and said, "This is it." He parked the car and looked at the building as if evaluating the place. Wanting to be polite, I asked, "Want to come up?" He smiled but shook his head with a hint of hesitation. "I'd love to, Ben, but I don't want to intrude. Let's leave it for next time. We'll plan something later if we survive this flight." He laughed, and I couldn't help but laugh too. His smile was contagious. "Deal then," I replied, still smiling. He nodded, and before I could say anything else, he was already leaving. But even after his car disappeared around the corner, I couldn't get him out of my head. Something about him had stirred something in me, and it wasn't just his looks, though he was indeed stunning. He was about 47, but looked younger, with the body of someone who takes care of himself, the posture of a successful businessman. And I like that type, that style, that way of speaking, of looking, of smiling. It was as if he had left a mark on me, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. Days passed, and my anticipation for the flight only grew. When the agreed-upon day finally arrived, I decided to send a message to confirm. The truth was, I just wanted a reason to talk to him again. I wrote something simple. "Hey, Alexander, how's it going? Just confirming the flight this afternoon." His reply came quickly, and I could barely hide my excitement as I read it. "Hey, Ben. What a nice surprise. All good here. Can't wait." That message made my heart race. What a nice surprise. What did he mean by that? Was he as excited as I was? Or was he just being polite? And worse, did he even like other men, or was I completely misinterpreting everything? I kept analyzing his words, trying to decipher what might be behind that message. He was so charming, so self-assured, that it was hard not to have expectations. But at the same time, I didn't want to get ahead of myself. I decided the best thing to do was not to overthink and just wait to see how things would unfold during the flight. After all, the sky had always been my place of clarity. Maybe up there, I'd find some answers. The time finally came, and I was already there, prepared. I had other flights in the morning, so I was in the rhythm, but the anticipation of flying with him felt different. At the agreed time, he arrived, looking as stunning as ever, with that smile that seemed to light up everything around him. I greeted him with a nod and a smile, trying to mask my own nervousness. "Ready to fly?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He laughed, but I could tell he was a little nervous. "Not sure about ready, but I'm here." I went over more instructions, explaining every detail calmly, and we helped each other with the equipment. When everything was set, we took our first steps toward takeoff. At first, he was visibly tense, gripping the harness tightly, eyes wide open. "Relax, Alexander," I said in a calm voice, almost as if soothing a startled horse. "The wind is perfect today. Just trust me." He took a deep breath, and little by little, I felt his body relax. When we finally took off, his fear gave way to a smile of pure admiration. The wind enveloped us, and the world below seemed small, distant. It was just him, me, and the sky. "How are you feeling?" I asked as we glided smoothly. He laughed, and for the first time he seemed completely at ease. "Better than I imagined. You were right, Ben. This is incredible." And at that moment I knew it wasn't just the flight he found incredible. In the middle of the flight, something happened that completely caught me off guard. The situation was already intense. Alexander pressed against me, the wind surrounding us, his cologne blending with the fresh air. It was impossible not to notice how close he was, how his body fit against mine, how that moment felt intimate. My mind started wandering. Thoughts I shouldn't have at that moment suddenly took over. I tried to focus on the flight, the clouds, the horizon, but it was useless. He was there, and I couldn't ignore it. And then, the inevitable happened. I got excited, and judging by the way he shifted slightly, as if adjusting his position, I had the terrible feeling that he had noticed. My face burned with embarrassment, and I tried to cover it up by talking about the wind or the view, anything to change the focus, but it was clear that the energy between us had shifted. He didn't say anything, but I could feel something different, as if he was aware of what was happening and maybe even amused by it. I, on the other hand, was dying of embarrassment, trying to distract myself, but failing miserably. The rest of the flight was a mix of awkwardness and an unspoken connection I wasn't sure how to define. When we finally landed, I could barely look him in the eyes, but when I did, he was smiling as if he knew exactly what had happened, and somehow that smile made me even more flustered. As we removed the equipment, the silence between us was strangely comfortable, yet loaded with something neither of us wanted to name. He helped untie the straps, and our hands brushed for a moment, almost unintentionally. I felt a chill in my stomach, but tried to play it cool, focusing on folding the paraglider carefully. "You make this look so easy," he commented, watching my movements. I looked at him and smiled. "It's practice. After a while, you get the hang of it." He shook his head as if impressed, but said nothing more. When we finally finished packing everything up, he stood still for a moment, looking at me thoughtfully. "Ben," he started, but then hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Yes?" I asked, trying to sound casual but feeling my heart race. He smiled, a bit awkwardly, and then said, "Thank you. Really? This was special. That word lingered in the air between us, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I just managed to smile and say, "Whenever you want to do it again, just let me know." He laughed, and this time, his smile carried promises neither of us was ready to acknowledge. But for now, it was enough. We got into the support car and started getting ready to leave. Before saying goodbye, he looked at me with a smile, part shy, part confident, and said, "Ben, I'd like to invite you over. I want to cook you dinner as a thank you." The invitation caught me by surprise, but I didn't hesitate to accept. Of course, I'd love to. He seemed relieved by my answer and smiled, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Then it's settled. Tomorrow night?" "Settled," I replied, trying not to seem as excited as I felt inside. He nodded and, before getting into the car, looked at me once more, as if to make sure I would really show up. "I'll send you the address. See you tomorrow, Ben." "See you tomorrow, Alexander." When he drove away, I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Dinner at his place? That felt like much more than just a thank you, and I couldn't stop thinking about what it might mean. But for now, I decided not to get my hopes up too much. After all, the next day would bring its own surprises. Sunday arrived, and I got ready with a level of care I hadn't had in a long time. I chose an outfit that was casual but elegant enough for dinner at his place. When I arrived at the address he had sent me, I was left speechless. The house was enormous, the kind you only see in movies, an imposing gate, a perfectly manicured garden, and architecture straight out of a design magazine. I rang the doorbell, and the gate slowly opened as if inviting me into a world completely different from my own. I walked up to the main door, and there he was, as gorgeous as ever, smiling with a relaxed air. He was wearing shorts and a simple t-shirt, yet he looked like he had just stepped out of a fashion editorial. "Welcome, Ben," he said, with a smile that immediately put me at ease. "Thanks," I replied, still a bit overwhelmed by it all. He gestured for me to come in, and as soon as I stepped inside, he led me to the kitchen. "Come on, let's have dinner. I'll show you the house later." Following him to the kitchen felt like stepping into a dream. The house was even more impressive inside, with modern furniture, artwork on the walls, and lighting that made everything feel even cozier. But what caught my attention the most was him, so at ease in that environment, as if he was completely in control. When we reached the kitchen, the smell of food was incredible. He had prepared something that looked like it came straight out of a fine dining restaurant, and I could hardly believe he had done it all himself. "I hope you like it," he said as he served the plates. "I'm sure I will," I replied, sensing that this night would be much more than just dinner. We ate, talked, and drank wine that seemed to have been carefully chosen. The food was amazing, but what truly impressed me was how effortlessly our conversation flowed. It was as if we had known each other for years, not just a few days. After dinner, he stood up and said, "Come on, I'll show you the house." We started with the backyard, where a beautifully lit pool sparkled under the starry sky. The outdoor area was impeccable, a perfect blend of sophistication and comfort. Then he showed me the other rooms, each with its own unique style, but all maintaining the elegance I had come to expect. Finally, we reached his bedroom. He opened the door and gestured for me to step inside. "This is my room. Come in. Make yourself comfortable." Entering his bedroom felt like stepping into a sacred space. The room was spacious, with a massive bed, heavy curtains, and a minimalist yet deeply personal decor. There were books scattered around, a guitar in one corner, and a scent that was unmistakably his, something I had already noticed during the flight. I stood still for a moment, taking it all in. He was right there beside me, and the silence between us was charged with something neither of us wanted to name just yet. "What do you think?" he asked, with a smile that seemed to hide more than it revealed. "It's incredible," I replied, knowing I wasn't just talking about the room. He chuckled softly, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking, then took a step closer. "I'm glad you like it." And at that moment, I knew the night had much more to offer. He sat on the bed, looking at me with a mix of seriousness and vulnerability I had never seen in him before. "Come sit here. I want to ask you something." My heart pounded, and I felt nervous, unsure of what to expect. I sat beside him, trying to appear calm, but I knew he could sense my anxiety. He placed his hand on my leg, a gesture that was both reassuring and provocative, and began speaking in a voice that was soft yet filled with emotion. Ben, when I first saw you, something about you awakened a desire in me, something I've always been curious to explore but never had the courage to. I looked at him, trying to process his words. Oh yeah? And what would that be? I asked, attempting to keep my voice steady despite feeling like I was treading into unknown territory. He took a deep breath as if gathering courage and continued. It's hard to talk about. I'm afraid of being wrong, of misinterpreting things, but after what I felt during the flight, I found the courage to ask you. Ben, have you ever been with another man? Would you consider being with me? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his confession. Alexander, I apologize for what happened during the flight. I couldn't help myself. Having you so close to me, it awakened something I'd never felt before. He was silent for a moment, as if processing my words, then started to pull away slightly, as if thinking he had made a mistake. But I held his gaze and continued. To answer your question, no, I've never been with another guy. But I want to experience it with you. And yes, I want to be with you. His face changed completely. The doubt was replaced by a smile that was both relieved and filled with desire. He leaned in slowly, giving me time to pull away, but I didn't. Our lips met in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened. It was as if all the fear, curiosity, and attraction we had been holding back had finally found an escape. We tumbled onto the bed, our kiss growing more intense, our hands exploring each other with a mix of care and urgency, as if neither of us could quite believe what was happening. I surrendered completely, feeling the strong, confident man giving himself to me. It was surreal, like living a dream I hadn't even known I had. Each touch, each sigh, each glance exchanged confirmed that this was real. And in the midst of all that intensity, I knew that nothing would be the same after that night. As we lay together afterward, recovering our breath, the silence between us was comfortable, as if no words were needed to understand what we were feeling. After a while, I got up to clean myself up in the bathroom. When I returned, I got dressed and began to say goodbye. Alexander walked me to the door, and as we moved through the house, something on the wall caught my attention. It was a photo of him with another man. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I got closer and saw who the other man was, I almost couldn't believe it. It was my father. I stood frozen, staring at the photo, trying to process what it meant. But this story has gone on long enough. I'll tell you why he has a picture with my father next time. Meanwhile, subscribe to the channel to follow part 2. And if you want to hear the explicit version of this story with all the details, the link is in the comments. Kisses and see you soon.